subscribe to Dr. Nightmare Channel now.
Story 1. Reflections on Still Water. The lake was perfectly still the day Mara and Theo arrived at the house. It was a mirror of clouds and distant pines, not even a ripple to betray the chill that lay beneath its surface. The house, squatting just at the edge of the tree line like it had grown from the soil itself, hadn't been touched in over a year, not since Theo's uncle had drowned in that same lake. That fact clung to Mara's thoughts, stubborn and damp, no matter how many times Theo told her it was just a freak accident. Old man, slippery dock, cold water. But the way his body had been found, with his back broken and his arms tangled in a tattered sheet of black cloth, was harder to explain away. Still, Theo wanted to clear the house out, sell it, move on. Mara just wanted to be there for him. It took them until sunset to unpack the basics. The house creaked like old bones settling, and the dock outside swayed even though the water barely moved. It made Mara uncomfortable, the quiet, not peaceful quiet, the kind that's too still, like something is waiting for a cue. As night settled in, Theo lit a fire in the stone hearth and uncorked a bottle of wine left behind in the kitchen. They found 2 chairs that didn't look like they'd collapse and sat in front of the flames. The silence thickened. That's when Mara noticed the mirror. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and tucked against the wall near the hallway. It hadn't been there when they first arrived. She was sure of it. "Hey, where did that come from?" she asked, pointing. Theo looked up. "What, the mirror?" "Yeah, that wasn't there earlier." He shrugged. "I think it was. Probably just didn't notice." Mara frowned. She wasn't the type to miss something that large. She stood, walking toward it. The mirror was old, the frame carved in strange looping swirls, like water caught mid-whirl. She looked into it and saw herself clearly. Same dark sweater, same messy ponytail, but something about the image felt off. Slightly delayed, maybe, like her reflection was watching her just a beat too long. She reached out and pressed her fingers to the glass. It was warm. She stepped back quickly. Theo chuckled. "What, expecting Bloody Mary?" "No," she said, forcing a smile. "Just, it's weird, that's all." They went to bed around midnight. The fireplace had gone out. Mara pulled the bedroom curtains tight to block the moonlight. That night, she dreamed of the lake. In her dream, she was floating above the water, looking down at herself. But the version of her in the water wasn't floating. It was staring up, eyes open, pale and lifeless. Her reflection grinned. Mara awoke in a sweat. Theo was still asleep beside her, breathing slow and heavy. She walked to the bathroom to splash water on her face. The mirror in there, an old oval one with tarnished silver edges, fogged from her breath, but she could still make out her face. Her eyes looked tired, her skin pale. But the reflection didn't match her movements. It blinked when she didn't, tilted its head the wrong way. Her chest tightened. She wiped the mirror clean with her sleeve. The reflection snapped back to normal. "What the hell?" she whispered. She didn't tell Theo, not yet. Maybe it was sleep, maybe it was nerves. But later that morning, while they were sorting through boxes in the attic, Theo let out a frustrated sigh and stood up. "I can't believe Uncle Craig kept this much junk. Look at this." He held up a faded photograph, black and white, with a group of people standing by the lake. Mara took it. It showed maybe 7 people, all facing the camera, all blurry, except for one, a woman in the background, almost hidden behind a tree. She wasn't facing the camera. She was looking directly to the side, as if she were staring at the person holding the photo now. "Who's that?" Mara asked. Theo squinted. "No idea. Maybe a neighbor? She looks like she's watching." He shrugged. "Creepy people live near lakes. I guess it comes with the territory." Mara turned the photo over. On the back was written in faded ink, "Do not look into the water after dark." That night, Mara couldn't sleep again. The mirror in the hallway, it was still there, and it felt like it was waiting. She crept out of bed and stood in front of it, wrapped in a blanket. The house was quiet, but the kind of quiet that hums. She stared at her reflection, daring it to misbehave. For a moment, it was still. Then, her reflection blinked, but Mara hadn't. She gasped and stumbled back. The reflection stayed still. Then, it smiled. And that's when she saw it, not in the mirror, but behind her. A shape, tall and dark, standing in the hallway behind her shoulder. She spun around. Nothing. She turned back. The reflection had returned to normal. She turned on every damn light in the house. Theo finally confronted her the next morning. "You've been weird ever since we got here," he said, sitting across from her at the breakfast table. "What's going on?" She told him everything. The mirror, the reflection, the dreams, the photograph. Theo went quiet. "I didn't want to tell you, but something's been bugging me too." He walked to a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. They were in a box in the basement. Old journal entries, Uncle Craig's. "Listen to this." He read, "February 3rd. I saw her again last night, in the mirror, in the lake. She waits for the reflection to move and then she steps out. I think I've trapped her. But the mirror is shifting. I swear it moved last night. If it ends up in the hall again, I'll know I failed." Mara's blood went cold. "He was trying to trap something?" she asked. Theo nodded. "And it moved, just like you said." He looked pale. They decided to move the mirror, just to be safe. They carried it out to the garage and covered it with an old tarp. Mara felt a relief for the first time since arriving. But that night, she woke again, and it was back. The mirror was in the hallway, waiting. They planned to leave in the morning, but the lake wasn't going to let them. At 3:17 a.m., the house began to shake. Not violently, not like an earthquake, more like something was moving through it. Theo sat up first. "Did you hear that?" Mara nodded wide-eyed. Then the lights flickered and the mirror in the hallway began to glow, a pale, cold light. They stepped into the hall together. In the mirror, their reflections stood still. Then Mara's reflection turned its head, not sideways, but completely around, snapping like a twist of wet rope. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. No sound came out, but the glass cracked from the inside. Theo grabbed Mara's hand and ran. They bolted for the car, but the front door wouldn't open. From the lake, outside the window, something rose. A shape, tall, draped in dripping black cloth, with a face that looked like shattered porcelain. It stared through the glass, and Mara saw herself in it. Not her reflection. Herself. Cold, drowned, smiling. They escaped the house by smashing the window in the back, Blood on Theo's arm, splinters in Mara's feet. They ran through the woods barefoot in the dark until they reached the neighbor's property, a mile away. Police came at dawn. They found the house empty. No mirror in the hallway, no photo in the attic, no journal. Just a black, tattered cloth on the floor near the fireplace, and in the lake, only the faintest ripple, as if someone had just slipped beneath the surface. Months later, Mara still dreams about the lake. Sometimes she sees herself walking into it. Sometimes she sees herself climbing out. And sometimes, when she passes a mirror, her reflection just lingers. Not smiling, just waiting.
Story 2. Reflections on Still Water. A lake house horror story. The lake was perfectly still the day Mara and Theo arrived at the house. It was a mirror of clouds and distant pines, not even a ripple to betray the chill that lay beneath its surface. The house, squatting just at the edge of the tree line like it had grown from the soil itself, hadn't been touched in over a year, not since Theo's uncle had drowned in that same lake. That fact clung to Mara's thoughts, stubborn and damp, no matter how many times Theo told her it was just a freak accident. Old man, slippery dock, cold water. But the way his body was found, with his back broken and his arms tangled in a tattered sheet of black cloth, was harder to explain away. Still, Theo wanted to clear the house out, sell it, move on. Mara just wanted to be there for him. It took them until sunset to unpack the basics. The house creaked like old bones settling, and the dock outside swayed even though the water barely moved. It made Mara uncomfortable. The quiet, not peaceful quiet, the kind that's too still, like something is waiting for a cue. As night settled in, Theo lit a fire in the stone hearth and uncorked a bottle of wine left behind in the kitchen. They found 2 chairs that didn't look like they'd collapse and sat in front of the flames. The silence thickened. That's when Mara noticed the mirror. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and tucked against the wall near the hallway. It hadn't been there when they first arrived. She was sure of it. "Hey, where'd that come from?" she asked, pointing. "What? The mirror?" "Yeah, that wasn't there earlier." He shrugged. "I think it was. Probably just didn't notice." Mara frowned. She wasn't the type to miss something that large. She stood, walking toward it. The mirror was old, the frame carved in strange looping swirls, like water caught mid-whirl. She looked into it and saw herself clearly. Same dark sweater, same messy ponytail. But something about the image felt off. Slightly delayed, maybe, like her reflection was watching her just a beat too long. She reached out and pressed her fingers to the glass. It was warm. She stepped back quickly. Theo chuckled. "What, expecting Bloody Mary?" "No," she said, forcing a smile. "Just, it's weird, that's all." They went to bed around midnight. The fireplace had gone out. Mara pulled the bedroom curtains tight to block the moonlight. That night, she dreamed of the lake. In her dream, she was floating above the water, looking down at herself. But the version of her in the water wasn't floating. It was staring up, eyes open, pale and lifeless. Her reflection grinned. Mara woke up in a sweat. Theo was still asleep beside her, breathing slow and heavy. She walked to the bathroom to splash water on her face. The mirror in there, an old oval one with tarnished silver edges, fogged from her breath, but she could still make out her face. Her eyes looked tired, her skin pale, but the reflection didn't match her movements. It blinked when she didn't, tilted her head the wrong way. Her chest tightened. She wiped the mirror clean with her sleeve. The reflection snapped back to normal. "What the hell?" she whispered. She didn't tell Theo, not yet. Maybe it was sleep, maybe it was nerves. But later that morning, while they were sorting through boxes in the attic, Theo let out a frustrated sigh and stood up. "I can't believe Uncle Craig kept this much junk. Look at this." He held up a faded photograph, black and white, with a group of people standing by the lake. Mara took it. It showed maybe 7 people, all facing the camera, all blurry, except one, a woman in the background, almost hidden behind a tree. She wasn't facing the camera. She was looking directly to the side, as if she was staring at the person holding the photo now. "Who's that?" Mara asked. He squinted. "No idea. Maybe a neighbor? She looks like she's watching." He shrugged. "Creepy people live near lakes. I guess it comes with the territory." Mara turned the photo over. On the back was written in faded ink, "Do not look into the water after dark."
Story 3. The Deep End of Nowhere. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just 2 nights, no phones, no distractions, just a quiet cabin by the lake where Kayla and Leo could finally disconnect from the noise of life. Kayla had offered the idea casually, saying her cousin's old lake house hadn't been used in years and needed some life breathed back into it. Leo wasn't thrilled about the idea at first, but when she promised beer, a bonfire, and a couple of quiet swims, he agreed. When they pulled into the long gravel driveway that evening, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. The house was older than Leo expected. Faded gray wood siding, slanted porch steps, and a dock that looked like it might give way with a strong breeze. The lake itself stretched out into the horizon, still and perfectly flat like black glass. Not a single ripple, despite the breeze coming through the pines. "You didn't say it was haunted looking," Leo muttered, eyeing the place. Kayla laughed. "Don't be dramatic, it's just secluded. You said you wanted something remote." Leo shrugged. He had, but something about the silence surrounding the lake unnerved him. Not peaceful silence, complete silence, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. Inside, the house was cold and dusty, but not dirty. The furniture was basic and old, cabin style. There were no personal touches, just a few family photos in dusty frames. One thing struck Leo immediately, though. There were no mirrors. Not in the bedroom, not in the bathroom, even a handheld one. Every spot where a mirror should have been was either empty or replaced with a blank wooden board. Even the medicine cabinet had been stripped of glass. Leo asked about it, and Kayla brushed it off, saying her cousin didn't like mirrors. "She's kind of sensitive about reflections," she added vaguely. Leo raised an eyebrow, but didn't push it. That night, They sat on the back deck and drank cheap beer while watching the lake. The water still hadn't moved. Not a shimmer, not a wave, just smooth, pitch-black glass under a growing moon. Kayla sat silently for a long time, staring out across the still surface. "They say no one's ever found the bottom," she said suddenly. "Of the lake?" She nodded. "It's natural, very deep, cold too. A few people have drowned over the years. They don't always recover the bodies." That was the first time Leo wondered how her cousin's husband had died. Later that night, Leo woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper, but distorted, as though it was coming through water. He sat up in bed and noticed that Kayla was gone. The window was open, letting in the damp night air. Worried, he stepped into the hallway and then toward the back door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the crack, he saw her, standing at the edge of the dock in her nightgown, perfectly still. He called out her name softly, then again louder, but she didn't respond. He approached slowly, the dock creaking underfoot. When he finally reached her, he gently touched her shoulder. She jerked back, startled, like she hadn't known he was there. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tense. "I thought I saw something in the lake," she said, blinking slowly. Her voice was flat, detached. Leo looked out at the lake. There was nothing there, just the still reflection of the moon and the dark outline of the trees. The next morning, Kayla had no memory of the dock. She insisted she must have been sleepwalking. Leo didn't believe her. Something about her demeanor had changed. She barely spoke through breakfast, and when they went outside later that afternoon, she refused to go near the lake. She stayed on the deck while Leo, curious and uneasy, stepped into the shallow water. It was freezing, far too cold for July. It sent a shock through his legs and chest, and he stumbled back onto the dock. That night, while they were unpacking a few extra blankets from the bedroom closet, Leo found something behind a stack of old boxes. A mirror. It was tall and covered in a dusty sheet. The frame was warped and water damaged, and when Leo removed the sheet, what he saw disturbed him. It didn't show their reflections. Not at first. It showed the bedroom behind them, but without them in it, as if they weren't there at all. Then slowly, Kayla's reflection faded in, but it wasn't her. The mirrored version of Kayla was smiling. Kayla herself wasn't. Her reflection stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes. When Leo stepped into view, nothing happened. He had no reflection. He backed away, instinctively confused and frightened. "Did you see that?" he asked, but Kayla just stared at the mirror in silence. "We should put that back," she whispered, and they did. But Leo couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been a normal mirror and that something inside it had been watching them. That night, the mirror moved. Leo woke up sometime after midnight to a sound like dragging furniture. When he opened the bedroom door, he saw it. The mirror was now standing at the end of the hallway, completely uncovered and angled toward their door. It was taller than he remembered. He crept forward, heart pounding, and stood before it. This time, his reflection was there, but it didn't move like him. It blinked first, just a second before he did. Then its head tilted, just a little too far, then more. The neck bent in a sharp, unnatural angle. Leo turned and walked away, refusing to look back. By morning, the mirror had gone from the hallway. Kayla, meanwhile, was getting worse. She stared out at the lake for hours, not blinking. She barely ate, barely spoke. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost grayish hue. When Leo tried to hold her hand, it was cold and damp, like she just pulled it out of ice water. Then she said something that chilled him to his bones. "It wants us," she murmured. "What does?" "The lake. It's calling." Leo decided they needed to leave immediately. They packed in a hurry, throwing bags into the car. Kayla moved slowly, as if every step was a burden. She seemed reluctant to go. As they pulled away from the house, Leo glanced into the rearview mirror and froze. There, standing upright in the middle of the gravel driveway, was the mirror. It hadn't been in the house. It was just there, facing the car, reflecting nothing. They didn't stop, but every few miles it appeared again. In the road, in the woods, even briefly visible in a puddle they drove past. Each time it was closer. Each time the reflection inside it became clearer. Kayla's face, staring back, expressionless, watching Leo. They made it to a motel merely 2 hours from the lake. Leo double-checked every lock, every curtain. He turned on the bathroom light and splashed water on his face. Behind him, Kayla stared into the mirror. "This one's wrong," she whispered. Leo looked up. Her reflection wasn't matching her anymore. It was crying. Blood ran down her face. Then it began to scream. But there was no sound. Kayla just stared at it. Leo grabbed her arm to pull her away, and the mirror shattered. Behind the glass was a gaping black void. Not a wall, not drywall, just space. Wet, shifting with something moving beneath it. They left the motel without another word. No one ever saw them again. Days later, a local hiker found an abandoned car parked near the lake. The doors were open. A trail of footprints led from the car to the dock. 2 sets at first, then one, then none. And at the end of the dock was standing upright in the exact center, the mirror, still, facing the lake.
Story 4: Beneath the Floorboards. When the bank foreclosed on Henry's grandfather's lake house, he didn't expect to inherit it. He hadn't even known it existed. The house wasn't in the family's will. His parents had never spoken of it. The deed came in the mail with a letter that said simply, "If you ever go, do not remove the floorboards." At first, Henry laughed. He assumed it was a joke. Old man paranoia. Still, curiosity itched to him. So he took the drive upstate, just for the weekend, just to look it over before deciding whether to keep it or sell it. The place sat on the edge of Ashby Lake, buried deep in pine forest, far off the grid. The gravel road leading to it was so overgrown he almost missed the turn. The lake itself was silent and black, cold-looking, lifeless. The house was small, log-built, with 1 floor and a creaky wraparound porch. The windows were dusty, and the smell of mold hit him the moment he walked in. It wasn't cozy. It wasn't warm. It felt like something had been waiting. Inside, the furniture was all covered in white sheets, cobwebs strung across corners like forgotten memories. The floor creaked with every step, but what stood out the most was the flooring in the living room. Wide, uneven wood planks, old as hell, but 2 of them were different, newer, untouched by rot or time. They had no nails, no wear, like they'd been replaced recently. Henry remembered the letter's warning, "Do not remove the floorboards." So, of course, he became obsessed with them. The first night was quiet, no cell signal, no internet. He read, drank half a bottle of cheap scotch, and fell asleep on the couch with the fire crackling low. But around 3 a.m., something woke him. It wasn't loud, it was vibrational, like the low thrum of machinery. He sat up. The room was pitch black. The fire was out. Then he realized the sound was coming from beneath him, under the floorboards. A steady pulsing hum, like breathing. He stood and listened, heart pounding. It was faint, subtle, but undeniably there. Then it stopped, and something scratched once against the wood beneath his feet. The next morning, he convinced himself it was a dream, but when he went to make coffee, he noticed it. One of the new floorboards had shifted slightly, like something had pushed up from underneath. There were fingernail scrapes on the edges, tiny ones. Henry froze. He didn't have animals. The place was sealed tight. He checked the crawl space below, if you could even call it that. Just dirt, roots, and cobwebs, but no sign of anything living. No holes, no movement. Still, he couldn't stop staring at those boards. They weren't nailed down. They could be lifted. He resisted the urge that day, but by nightfall, the urge became something more. That evening, as the sun dipped below the pines, the sound returned. Breathing, but slower this time. Closer. Henry sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floorboards. Then came the scratching again. Once, twice, then 3 short rakes, like fingernails against wood. It stopped. Then, a whisper. Not a voice exactly, not words, just the sound of something speaking from a place it shouldn't. Henry whispered into the air, "Who's there?" Nothing. But the humming continued for 2 more minutes, then stopped altogether. He didn't sleep that night. At 4:12 a.m., he stood over the floorboards with a crowbar in his hand. "I just want to look," he muttered to himself. "One look." The first board came up easily. It was light, too light for old oak. Beneath it was dirt, but smooth, recently disturbed, as if someone had dug and then carefully patted it back down. He removed the second board. More dirt. And something else. A wooden box. Rough, unmarked, rope handles, buried only a few inches deep. Henry hesitated. His grandfather's letter rang in his mind. "Do not remove the floorboards." But it was too late now. He pulled the box out and placed it on the coffee table. It was warm to the touch, and it was breathing. Slow, rhythmic pulses under his fingertips. The lid wasn't nailed shut, just sealed with a strip of wax and twine. He didn't open it. Not yet. That night, the dreams came. He was in the lake, floating on his back, unable to move. The stars above him spun like constellations he didn't recognize. He tried to speak, but his mouth filled with water. Then he sank, slowly, pulled downward by unseen hands. As he slipped beneath the surface, he saw the house from below, upside down, its windows glowing red, the floorboards peeled away like skin. He woke up gasping. The box sat at the foot of his bed. He had left it in the living room. He took it outside, dragged it to the dock, held it over the water, ready to drop it. But something whispered again, not in the air, not from the box, but inside his own head. "You took me out. You opened the door." Henry dropped the box into the lake. It didn't sink. It floated. Then it cracked open, and something unfolded out of it, slowly, like fabric made of shadow. He stumbled backwards as the thing rose. A figure. Not quite human, not quite anything. Eyes like mirrors. A mouth that didn't move, but still whispered, "You brought me home." Then it sank beneath the water and vanished. He fled, left the house behind, drove 8 hours straight without stopping, back to the city, tried to forget. But 3 days later, the floor in his apartment creaked in the middle of the night. The sound came again, breathing, and then humming, the exact same hum. He pulled back the rug in his living room. 2 floorboards were different, newer, untouched by rot or time. He dropped to his knees, heart racing. On one of them, carved carefully into the wood, was a single sentence. "You opened the door."
Story 5. The Guest Book. It started with a last-minute cancellation. Anna and her boyfriend Marcus were supposed to go camping, but when the forecast turned stormy, her aunt offered something better: a quiet weekend at her late husband's old lake house. "It's peaceful," she said on the phone. "Hasn't been used in years, but the rain won't matter there. Just bring food, light a fire, and relax." Anna was hesitant. She remembered going there once as a child. The lake had scared her then, though she couldn't recall why. But Marcus was thrilled. Anything with indoor plumbing was better than a soggy tent. They arrived late on Friday, just as the rain began to fall. The cabin sat on a hill just above the lake, with a steep slope leading to a rickety dock and boathouse. It looked abandoned, but intact. Its windows were dark, the porch sagging, the chimney covered in moss. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and mothballs. Dust clung to everything. As they explored the living room, Anna found something on the coffee table, a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was faded. A black stain seeped through the lower corner. In handwritten gold letters, it read, "Guests." Marcus flipped it open. Inside were names written in different handwritings and styles. Some added dates, some wrote comments, but most pages were blank except for a name. No one had signed it since 1998. Anna felt a chill as she closed the book and set it aside. Something about it felt too heavy for what it was. That night, the storm grew worse. Wind howled through the pines and waves slapped against the dock. The power flickered, but never fully went out. As they settled in by the fireplace, Anna stared out the window toward the lake. She saw a flicker of light, brief, like a candle in the distance. "Did you see that?" she asked. Marcus looked up from his beer. "What?" "There was a light, out on the water." He walked over to the window. "Nothing." "You sure?" She nodded, but there was nothing now, just trees, rain, and shadows. They slept on the pull-out couch that night, too tired to set up the bedroom. Anna dreamed of the guest book. In her dream, she opened it again. This time, her name was already inside, written in red. Below it, the ink bled down the page, and she heard voices, whispers, one word, welcome. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the sky stayed heavy and gray. Anna stepped outside for fresh air and found Marcus already by the dock, skipping stones. "How long you been out here?" she asked. He shrugged. "Couple hours, maybe." "You didn't wake me?" He figured, "I'd let you sleep." He looked pale. "I had weird dreams," Anna said, walking beside him. "Me too, but I don't remember them." She glanced back up at the cabin. Something about the front window seemed wrong, like the reflection didn't quite match the angle. But when she blinked, it looked normal again. Later that day, while unpacking in the bedroom, Anna found something that hadn't been there the night before: the guest book. It was sitting on the nightstand. She called for Marcus, but he swore he hadn't moved it. "I left it on the coffee table," he said. Anna opened it. There was a new name, Ellen M. No date, no comment. "Do you know her?" Marcus asked. Anna shook her head slowly. "That's my aunt's name." They flipped to earlier pages, and there she was, Ellen M., 1993. Comment: "The lake is quieter now." This second entry wasn't in the same handwriting. There was Marcus, and there were dozens more, all dated, all written in red, all still legible. Even the oldest ones